cask strength, age statement, natural colour, non-chill filtered. Ding ding ding, we have a winner. This is a whiskey that ticks all of the boxes for craft presentation, and it guarantees them on the label. Honestly, I would absolutely love to only review whiskies like this that meet the full criteria, but I think that I'd probably run out of things to review quite quickly, and I think I'd probably also run out of money. This is Glen Scotia Seasonal Release 2022. So this Glen Scotia, it might be a little bit familiar to some of you because we did have one of these last year. It's a 12-year-old Glen Scotia, and we know that it spent 11 years in bourbon casks, and it spent the last 12 months being finished in Amontillado sherry casks. So Amontillado sherry is a type of sherry which is partially oxidized, which means that it is paler and drier than Oloroso and in particular PX sherry, but sweeter and darker than something like a Fino or Manzanilla. So this whiskey from Glen Scotia, which it's been out for a few weeks now, a couple of weeks perhaps, it sells in the UK online for around £80, which I think even though it is cask strength and fantastic presentation, I think that £80 is expensive for a 12-year-old whiskey. Going to be using my Glen Scotia glass today, which I haven't actually used for a long time. Probably the last time I used this glass is when I was at Glen Scotia. So let's get some in the glass. And see what it's like. It's also worth noting that this does seem like it's going to be something that we get every year from Glen Scotia now. Obviously this is limited edition and they call it the seasonal release. We did get one of these last year, and it looks like they're probably going to give us a different cask finish or different cask makeup every year, because last year we had Oloroso sherry and recharred casks. Now I didn't try that one myself because personally I think recharred casks and Oloroso is not really something that gets me too excited, but there are plenty of reviews of that expression from 2021 on YouTube, and I'll put a few of them in the description below. So for last year's release we've got a Ralphie review, we've got a review from Jason at Jason Whisky, we've got a review from Jim at Whisky Novice, and a review from Jeff over at G Whisky. Now, talking about last year's release, out of those four, I'd say that it's really only Jim at Whisky Novice and Jason at Jason Whisky that really liked the stuff. Other than those two, I think the verdict was basically okay but overpriced. And even looking at the review from Jim at Whisky Novice, he really liked last year's release but still overpriced. And that's probably not something that's going to change this year, because last year most people were complaining a little bit about the price at £75. This year at £80, it's gone up by £5. But hopefully, at least with the whiskey, we can do a little bit better on the verdict for what's in the bottle on this one. Although, almost goes without saying, it's overpriced. So, Glen Scotia seasonal release on the nose. Sweet and spicy on the nose. It's really got a reminiscent note of Christmas pudding on the nose. Getting lots of raisins, prunes, very fruity, slightly nutty, spicy, a little bit spirity, just reminding you that this is just a 12-year-old whiskey, but very sweet, very fruity, lots of overripe sugary fruit notes. There's also a slight lactic funk, kind of Campbelltown funk note in there, and just the lightest smokiness. I think they do say that this is an unpeated release, but I am getting a very faint smokiness on this one. Also getting seaside notes, maritime, sea foam, rock pools, which are notes that I quite often get in Glen Scotias and Campbelltown whiskies, as well as a buttery vanilla cream, and some notes of Dundee cake with almonds and walnuts on the nose. So let's see how it tastes. Very sweet and syrupy on the palate. Syrupy dates, which obviously is again a Christmassy note. Raisins, a slight rubbery grape note, a little bit reminiscent of like a dry white wine. I think that this is a whiskey that's got excellent body and intensity, but it really never feels like you're drinking a cask strength whiskey. It's absolutely not hot. There's no hotness or roughness to this. I think if I was given this blind, I would probably guess an ABV at around 48%. It's going to have one more sip. Excellent mouthfeel, and I think that there's a really thick, intense, almost cloying, syrupy cola sweetness to this one. So kind of like full sugar Coca-Cola, where it's got that really, really sugary, sweet, syrupy sweetness, alongside that slightly herbal quality that you get in full fat Coke. Also getting some marzipan on the palate, that rich fudgy maltiness coming through that I had on the nose, a little bit of background spice and raw oak, just adding a nice little bit of complexity. As for the finish, I'm going to go medium length with notes of raisins, grape and spices. Perhaps the length of that finish is slightly shorter than what you'd expect, and I do wonder if that's the influence of that cask finish, but really not too bad. I actually think that the Amontillado cask finish on this one has worked really, really well. I think that it's giving us a very obviously Christmassy themed whiskey with all the fruity, nutty, spicy notes, but really smartly and artfully done. And I have tried this whiskey with water because there's always going to be someone that asks. I don't think that this is a whiskey that needs water at all. It's very drinkable at the full strength of 53.3. Like I said before, it really doesn't seem like a 53.3% whiskey. But if you do want to add water to this, I think that it takes a little bit of the edge off. It makes it a milder, sweeter experience, but all of those wonderful flavours are essentially still there. I think that it's a whiskey that swims really, really well, and to that extent the ABV is really conveniently tweakable to whatever drinking strength you want. So what do I think about Glen Scotia 12-year-old seasonal release 2022? I didn't expect to love this whiskey, if I'm honest. I bought it thinking that's bloody expensive for a 12-year-old cask strength, and I thought that it was going to be an okay 12-year-old high-strength whiskey, and that would probably be about it. But I actually think that it's far more than that, and I'd even go as far to say that this is probably the best Glen Scotia that I've ever tried. On the theme of Glen Scotia, I do have a little bit of a confession. I have been to the distilleries where I got my Glen Scotia glass from, and I'd say that I've always been a little bit of a fan of Glen Scotia, not completely over the top, but I've always liked them as a distillery, even going back to kind of before it was trendy to like Glen Scotia. But I must say that I've never been entirely happy with their new range. I think they rebranded in 2015. It's about the same time as I visited the distillery. And that rebranded range, I've always kind of thought that the double cask is a little bit on the young and slightly rough side. The 15-year-old, to be fair, I haven't had since they rebranded that, so it's a long time ago now, but I thought that was okay. The 18-year-old I was quite underwhelmed with. I'd probably say that out of the core range, the Victoriana is probably my favourite of those, but still could be better, and it could be cheaper, because that Victoriana, it's not cheap anymore at all. It's very expensive NAS whiskey, and I think for that high price tag, it could do with being a bit older, a bit more complex, considering how much you have to pay. My unpopular opinion with Glen Scotia, and I've probably mentioned this before, I actually miss the old Disco Cow bottles. So anyone that's seen them will probably know what I'm talking about, but I'll put a picture on screen. That's what Glen Scotia bottles, different colours for each of the expressions, but that's what they used to look like before 2015. And I was a big fan of that range because I liked their base style. I liked that sort of creamy, malty, buttery, slight funky maritime quality that is pretty much present throughout the entire range. And I liked that you had a full range of age statements. Whereas now I feel like there's kind of different flavours at each age. With the old range, you could have a 10, 12, I think 15, 16, 18 and 21-year-old whiskey that was all basically the same cask recipe. So you had a sliding scale of prices and age statements, and it really catered to every age preference and every wallet. And I think that's a really good thing, and I really miss that, and I wish that more distilleries had that choice, because you look at the the local distillery to Glen Scotia, Springbank, you look at the standard Springbank range, you've got the 10 and the 12, which are similar-ish. But if you want a 15-year-old Springbank, you're taken to that heavily sherried style, and it's a very different experience to what you get with the 10 and the 12. If you want a 15, 16-year-old version of what you get in the Springbank 10, you can't really get it. Unless, of course, you go to the 18-year-old Springbank, but then that becomes very expensive. Going back to Glen Scotia, though, and the range that we can currently get from Glen Scotia, I do actually think that at least this year's, the 2022 Glen Scotia 12 cask strength seasonal release, goes above and beyond what you get from that core range. I think that this one has got the power that you get from the Glen Scotia Victoriana, but it's also got the complexity and the maturity that we used to get from those old age statement Disco Cow bottles. Like I said before, I do think that this is my favourite ever Glen Scotia that I've tried. I also think that this is probably a very good alternative to the Springbank 12 cask strength for anyone that's been hurting from the Springbank drought of 2022. And a large part of that is that I really love that Amontillado cask finish on this one. I'm not always a huge fan of cask finishes, but I think the fact that they've used that very middle of the road sherry, it's brought out a lot of flavours that you would normally associate with a dry sort of fino sherry finish, but it's also got a lot of the indulgent sweetness, sugary, dark, sort of ripe fruity notes that you would get from an Oloroso. So I do think that that's incredibly well done, really do like that. So on that note, and I'm really surprised to be saying this, I kind of do think that this is worth the money, which I really didn't expect when I bought this. I didn't expect to be saying that it is worth that high price point, because it is bloody expensive. And I still think that £80 is much more than any of us should be paying for a 12-year-old cask finished whiskey, even at cask strength. But what I'll say, at least with this one, if you do decide to buy it and it is overpriced, at least you get an above par whiskey for the price. As for a grade, I'm going to go with a B+ on this one. I'm slightly tempted to possibly even look at a very low A- on this one, because I do really like it. I think if I was factoring in the price, I would definitely not be considering going into the A category with this. But as you guys know, I never factor in price when I'm grading a whiskey. I grade a whiskey on its own merits, not what you have to pay for it. But it must be said that the fact that this stuff is so overpriced does make me feel a little bit better about sticking with the B+. Closing statement though, I do think that it's really interesting with this one, and I'm not entirely sure why, possibly a sign of how well made this stuff is, but I find it really interesting how drinkable this stuff is for a cask strength whiskey. It is a fairly weak cask strength whiskey, 53.3% ABV. It's not the strongest 12-year-old cask strength. You'd probably expect your average 12-year-old whiskey to come out a little bit stronger than that. But really, in my opinion, it never really gives you the impression that you're drinking anything over 50%. Another theory for that might be that cask finish, possibly the cask finish process has knocked a little bit of wind out of its sails. But whatever the reason, I think this stuff is totally drinkable neat and very enjoyable at that full strength, but also powerful enough. So that's the seasonal release out of the way with. What's next? I'm not going to be doing this for a little while, but it's coming up. It's only in a few weeks' time. The other seasonal event of the Whisky Lock calendar is Dramvent, the Whisky Advent calendar. So I've got mine. Hopefully a few of you guys have got yours. Hopefully you'll all be able to join me on December the 1st when I'll be cracking door number 1 open. And if you haven't got yours yet and you'd like to take part, have a look at the Master of Malt website. Not a sponsor, but Whisky Advent calendars, everyone loves them, don't they? Apart from the price, possibly, but the one that I've chosen this year, as I said before, it's the £99 one. It's the cheap option. I know it's not that cheap, but it's the cheap option compared to the others from Master of Malt. So hopefully that's going to make all of our pennies stretch a little bit further, and hopefully we can get some good value out of this. So thanks for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this view of the Glen Scotia 12-year-old seasonal edition. Let me know what you think about that one and about Glen Scotia. and see you on December the 1st. Cheers.